In the tradition of 3 approaches to Psychotherapy 1 with Dr. Carl Rogers, Dr. Frederick Pearls, and Dr. Albert Ellis. 3 approaches to Psychotherapy 2 with Dr. Carl Rogers, Dr. Everett Sjostrom, and Dr. Arnold Lazarus. We are honored to present, in part 1 of this 3rd series, Dr. Hans Strupp, Distinguished Professor of Psychology, Vanderbilt University, and author of Psychotherapy and the Modification of Abnormal Behavior, and co-author of Psychotherapy in a New Key, a guide to time-limited dynamic psychotherapy. In part 2, Dr. Donald Meichenbaum, Professor of University, and author of Cognitive Behavior Modification, an integrative approach, and stress inoculation training. In part 3, Dr. Aaron Beck, University Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, and author of Anxiety Disorders and Phobias, and Cognitive Therapy of Depression. And now our host, Dr. Everett Sjostrom.
In this, our 3rd series, we are again presenting 3 distinctly different approaches to psychotherapy. I leave it to Dr. Strupp, Dr. Meichenbaum, and Dr. Beck to present their theories and systems to you in their introductions and the therapy sessions that follow. But there are characteristics common to each of these 3 approaches that are perhaps as significant as their differences, and that are important reflections of where we are today in this challenging profession. Among the major challenges we face in psychotherapy are most simply what strategy or techniques will help to solve or improve the problem of the patient. What evidence do we have that the strategy will probably be effective? If it is effective, how or why? And how long will the process take? Dr. Strupp, Dr. Meichenbaum, and Dr. Beck are leaders in addressing the challenges in psychotherapy through their extensive research and in their concerns with developing and evaluating briefer forms of psychotherapy. I want to thank these 3 men and their client, Richard, for allowing us to share in their work and experiences. Now, part 1, Dr. Hans Strupp.
The approach to psychotherapy which my collaborators and I have been developing at Vanderbilt University is based on an interpersonal model. We have found it useful to view a patient's problems as disturbances in interpersonal relationships. We also place a good deal of emphasis on understanding the transactions between patient and therapist in the here and now. In a nutshell, we feel that interpersonal experiences, typically those in early childhood, have made a person sick. The purpose of psychotherapy is to provide a new relationship that can make the person well, or at least mitigate earlier damage. Together with Freud, I see psychotherapy as a form of education or after education, or in Alexander's phrase, as a corrective emotional experience. In short, therapy involves learning, and we now have to ask, how does it work and how does it come about? I think it can happen in 2 major ways. First, the therapist attempts to create a good human relationship and to understand the patient's inner world. This is done through communication of interest, through caring, through respect, and above all, through empathic listening. The patient must come to feel secure and free to express himself or herself. Second, while a good empathic relationship seems to be a major healing factor in all forms of psychotherapy, it is often not enough. The problem is precisely that the patient cannot take proper advantage of what a good human relationship has to offer. This is so because as a result of hurtful experiences in early childhood, patients have developed maladaptive patterns of behavior which in adult life create serious obstacles in their relationships. Freud made the revolutionary discovery that people tend to transfer feelings, attitudes, and behaviors from the past to the present and to reenact with significant people in their current life scenarios that are rooted in troublesome interpersonal relationships that stem from the past. For example, a patient may relate to the therapist as a powerful parent figure and assume the role of a weak and dependent child. In this and in many other ways, patients rigidly cling to the past, and they do so by what I call cyclical maladaptive patterns. A major task for the therapist is, one, to identify one of these patterns in the patient's life. Second, to bring it to the patient's attention. And third, to help the patient explore the ramifications in his or her current life. While such a maladaptive pattern may become apparent already in a first interview, it may take quite some time before it can be worked through and therapeutic change can occur. The therapist can be helpful in this because he or she is both a participant and an observer in what transpires in the patient-therapist relationship. As an observer, the therapist recurrently steps outside and comments on what transpires in the interaction. The therapist's own emotional reactions to the patient can also be of great value in therapy. They can also be, at times, a great hindrance. In sum, therapy involves learning that is cognitive learning, and learning that's experiential learning. That is, the patient learns to use the context of a good relationship with a sympathetic and empathic listener to acquire new or different patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. Thank you. Hello, Richard. I'm Hans Strupp. I'd like to ask you what brings you here and how I might be of help to you.
I just went through a divorce that I did not want. My wife divorced me, and I felt that we should continue on as going through therapy. And I'm having a very difficult time getting over the loss of my wife, the loss of our family, and also selling of the home. I'm quite devastated by it all.
Can you fill me in a little bit about how this divorce came about?
We were married about 5 years ago, and we were happy for the first 2 years. And then we just started drifting apart through, as I look back at it now, it was through lack of communications, I feel was the most part of it. We would sit there at the dinner table and just make small talk and talk about immaterial things, and we just drifted further and further apart, and we both held the anger inside of us. We were angry at each other. We did not communicate at all, and we just drifted further and further apart. And then at that point in time, after we were married for about 3 years, we did seek out some counseling.
Mm-hmm. Did that accomplish anything? Well, what did it accomplish?
The counseling at that time helped us look at each other. Or we looked at ourselves, not at each other. We looked at ourselves. And I believe that both my wife and I are better people for going to this counseling. But
this was individual therapy?
Yes, it was individual therapy. We did not go together.
Did you see the same therapist?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And we continued to go individually, and then my wife came to me one day and she said that she thought it would be a good idea if we separated for like 6 months or a year, and I would stay in the house and keep the house. And I agreed to that. I thought it was a good idea because we were just drifting further and further apart. And she moved out, took an apartment, and about 4 months later, we continued to go to therapy, and about 4 months later, she came back to me and said that she would never be coming home again, and that she wanted me to sell the house, and that she felt it was completely over between us.
Mm-hmm.
So I was quite devastated by this because I did not want this divorce. And I put the house up for sale. It's sold within 2 weeks, and we closed escrow within 6 weeks. And I took an apartment, and hoping that, because the house was quite a financial burden on us. It took 2 incomes to keep it going. And I moved into an apartment, and then I would call my wife up and see if she wanted to date, or we could continue on the therapy, but I wanted to save the marriage. And then after I'd been in my apartment for about 30 days, she called me up and said that she had filed for divorce.
What reason did she give for moving out?
We just weren't getting on. We just weren't getting along, that was all. There were no...
What precisely happened, or in what way did you not get along?
We didn't communicate.
Yeah, you said that at the beginning, that was a problem from the beginning.
Yes, and it still is to this day. Right now, it's still to this day. We just did not communicate. We would be sitting at the dinner table, and I would ask, my wife would be sitting there, and I could see she was angry. She was sulking. I would say, "What's the matter?" And she would say, "Nothing." Well, me being a nitwit at that time at myself, I would say, "Oh, okay, nothing's fine," so I would just drop it. I wouldn't pursue it. And then we would go to bed and get up the next morning and repeat the whole scene all over again. And we just absolutely did not communicate, and we just kept drifting further and further apart. We never discussed our problems whatsoever. Our lovemaking started to fall off, and it was just lack of communication is all it was. We just, even possibly she would have filed for divorce anyway if we would have communicated. But I feel so empty inside because we never really expressed ourselves to each other.
When you say that she would sit at the breakfast table and sulk, something must have happened the night before, or the day before, or the moment before. There must have been some things that you did that she reacted to, or some things that were going on between the two of you that the other reacted in very adverse ways. What comes to mind about that?
Okay, I believe part of it was that my wife did not think I was well educated enough at that time, for the social people that we were running around with at that time. I don't think she thought I was well educated enough. I am not a college graduate.
She was?
No, she is not, but she has high ideas for herself. And I think that she felt that these groups that we were socializing with at the time, a lot of times I felt that she was very embarrassed. She tried to protect me because I just wasn't an outgoing, vibrant pillar of the community type. I also think another thing that bothered her was that she made more money than I did. And I think that bothered her considerably.
Did it bother you?
Somewhat. It was not overpowering to me because I felt that our love was hold us together. It was not a big material thing to me at that time.
Yeah, I meant to ask you that when you first met her, when you were first married, I assume that happened fairly soon thereafter, or?
We went together about 2 years.
I see. There was a time when you were getting along pretty well, and these problems in communication, as you described them, did not occur, or they were...
Yes. When we first met, we had I guess a simple male-female relationship. We were infatuated with each other. I thought she was the most wonderful person in the world. She was attracted to me because I was physically good-looking, and at that point in my life, I did have I was comfortable financially, and we did seem to have a lot of things in common when we did get married.
Mm-hmm. So there was a good understanding, and the relationship was harmonious?
Yes, initially, yes.
Mm-hmm.
My wedding day was the happiest day of my life.
Mm-hmm. You had been married before?
No, this was my first marriage.
Had she been married before?
Yes.
I see. And there were some children?
My wife has 4 children.
She has 4 children. Well, getting back to the difficulties that eventually led to the divorce, I would like to pursue a little more the ideas that you were presenting about her feeling that you somehow didn't measure up to her expectations. How did you feel about that?
It made me feel very inadequate. When we would go out to, used to go to a lot of black tie affairs, and she would constantly cut in on my conversations, whether she was correcting me or she had something to contribute. It didn't make any difference. She would cut in. Mm-hmm. I can remember one time when we went to a nice affair, and there were about 4 couples sitting at the table, and the lady sitting next to me expressed a political opinion, and I disagreed with it. So I expressed my political opinion, and then after, which I made sure everyone at the table heard me, and after it was all over, my wife announced to the table that I always played the devil's advocate, which I wanted to punch her right in the mouth for saying that.
Mm-hmm. So you felt she was putting you down, and you were angry.
Yes.
So how did that result in her sulking in the morning? And saying, when you questioned what's going on, she would say nothing.
As I reflect back on it now, I'm sure that she was angry with me because I didn't present the perfect image at the dinner table the previous night, so it carried over into the morning, and rather than us sitting down and discussing it, mm-hmm. and saying, what the heck is going on here, she wouldn't say anything, and I would just, well, okay, I'll let it go. I wouldn't say anything, and then we would just...
And you would get angry, and she would be angry.
Yes, and we just didn't say anything about it. We were just both hoping, I guess, that it would just go away by itself.
It didn't?
No.
What happened instead?
We drifted further and further and further apart. The touching, the kissing, the holding, the caressing, the intimate looks, they weren't there anymore. Mm-hmm. And that's when finally it got to the point, I could see there was a problem, but never going to therapy before, never reading any self-improvement books, always just being basically interested in material things. I really didn't know how to handle it. I just didn't know what to do.
Did you discuss these problems, this estrangement that was occurring between the two of you? I didn't get the impression, at least until the time that you went to see the counselor. Did you discuss these things at all?
If there was any discussion at all, it was very, very limited. She wrote me 2 or 3, this is while we're still married, living together.
Yes.
She wrote me 2 or 3 letters from time to time, and would express her feelings, partially express her feelings. But I would read the letters, and then we would discuss them superficially. But there was never...
What did she say in those letters?
She would be angry. She was angry at herself for what she did.
You mean to criticize you? Or?
Yes. She would be angry at herself for what she did, and she would feel bad. And so I took it as an apology, And I would go to her and I'd say, gee, that's fine. I'm glad you wrote the letter. And we would talk about the letters superficially, but we never got to the real meat of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Whose idea was it to seek professional help?
My wife's.
And you went along? She felt that that would be helpful to improve the marital relationship?
Yes, she went, when she first started going to the counselors, I think she went like 3 or 4 months, and she told me, I didn't even get the impact of the whole thing. You know, I almost had my head buried in sand almost. She told me she's going to a counselor. Oh, okay, fine, great. Good, you need it. So after she went to the counselor for like 3 or 4 months, and then she says, I want you to start going too. And I could see our relationship was just absolutely deteriorating. And so I said, fine, I'll go. I always referred to it as one flew over the cuckoo's nest, because I was not crazy about therapy whatsoever at that point in my life. And I started going, and I could see the benefits that I was receiving from this. And I felt that if my wife was receiving as many benefits as I was, we were going to pull this marriage back together again.
Mm-hmm. Were you aware of any things that you might have been doing to aggravate the situation or create in part the problems that arose? That is, were you doing, might you, obviously, you know, you couldn't do much about the income, you couldn't do much about the education. Somehow or other she was disappointed in you, but might there have been something? You said you kind of rejected the idea of seeking help. Might there have been other things that somehow made it worse?
She complained to me several times that I was not attentive enough to her. I did not caress her. I did not hold her enough. We did not make love enough times. She wanted more physical attractions.
Mm-hmm. You said earlier you were rather strongly in love with her. There was a strong attraction there. That had worn off, or you
initially,
lost?
Yes. Initially, when we dated, and then let's say like the first 2 years of the marriage, and then we started drifting apart after that.
Mm-hmm. So you felt basically that she was somehow disappointed in you, or dissatisfied, or displeased, or in
yes.
one way or another. And were you asking yourself questions as to what you might have been contributing to this, or were continuing to contribute to this?
At that time, when I first started noticing negative thoughts, my own negative thoughts towards my wife, I was telling myself that it was her fault.
Yes.
It's not me, it's her. And when...
the negative thoughts were what?
She's just a bitch.
Uh-huh.
She's screwed up.
You were getting very angry at her.
Yes. And I was... When she would criticize me, rather than calling it on her and saying, well, hey, you know, that's your opinion. If you want to express your opinion, fine, but that's not the way I see it. Rather than discussing it and expressing your opinions, my attitude was, well, I'm going to get even with her. I'm going to get back at her. She criticized me at the dinner table one night. Well, I'm going to get her. The next Saturday night, I'm going to get her. I'm going to put her in her place.
Have you had similar kinds of relationships in which you were angry, or your partner was somehow dissatisfied, or was this the first time this ever happened in your life?
Up until I was married to my ex-wife, women were just more or less sex objects to me. I was never really interested in getting married. They were just dates, somebody for Saturday night. I would go with a girl for 2, 3, 4 years until they started hammering me about getting married, and I wanted no part of it. Mm-hmm. Until I met...
Closeness, intimacy, other than physical, was not much of an issue.
No.
You weren't looking for it, and it didn't seem to be important to you? Am I putting words in your mouth?
No, no, not at all. I knew there was something missing. Say I dated for like 20 years or whatever it was. I knew there was something missing. But I just never could reach down inside of myself and come to say, hey, I love you. Mm-hmm. It was very difficult for me.
So this was really the first time that while you were married, you lived close range with a woman, mm-hmm. and that brought about these problems that have to do, it seems to me, with difficulties in intimate relationships, and where you felt somehow put down, or in certain ways your partner was disappointed in you, or there was a lot of angry interchange. I mean, there clearly was something basically wrong in the relationship that needed, I think, to be worked out.
Yes.
And I think it's also not unimportant that you had a number of sort of fleeting, shall we say, relationships, or impermanent relationships. You were how old when you got married?
42.
Uh-huh. And had you ever been wondering why you hadn't married sooner, or did this just not...
Well, for one thing, I was looking for the perfect woman.
I see.
She had to have the perfect personality and the perfect body. And...
they're hard to find.
Yes, I'm going to start looking again, though, but I'm not going to take 25 years to find one. I finally come to realize that I put my expectations way too high. I had to look at myself and see what do I have to offer. When Connie and I got married, I thought she was the most perfect woman in the entire world.
Mm-hmm. But apparently she had certain expectations of you too that you didn't meet.
Yes.
So it may have been a situation where both of you had very high expectations of the other, and you couldn't fulfill them because both of you were looking for perhaps the kind of people that don't exist,
yes.
or the kind of relationship that doesn't exist, and you were sort of brought down hard to reality, finding out that you had shortcomings, that she had shortcomings, and you somehow weren't able to come to terms with those.
Several months ago, I alluded this to the counselor. When I went in to see him one day, I said, you know, I feel sorry for Connie. I mean, I was filled with anger and hatred at this time. I mean, I was really mad at her. But I could still bring to myself, you know, I feel sorry for Connie because I think she's possibly looking for the man that does not exist. The man that's perfect. And mm-hmm. I just don't think she'll ever find it.
But by the same token, you're also looking for the woman that perhaps doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, you know, the next Saturday night, you never know what happens. Anyway.
You're not quite convinced that that's impossible, that maybe you need to examine some things there about, well, whether the kind of partner you're looking for can be found. Interestingly, too, that at first, your wife was that ideal person, but then things went downhill, and apparently they went downhill also as far as she was concerned. She felt dissatisfied, and
yes.
you weren't meeting her needs, and she felt you know, the other way around too. That mm-hmm. is, you weren't meeting each other's needs. Well, I've been asking you a lot of questions. Are there any questions you want to ask me?
How are the Commodores going to do in football next year? I wasn't ready for that. I have a lot of questions to ask you. where do I go from at this point in my life? How do I get started? I want to get started. How do I get started again? I'm depressed from the divorce. I don't have a woman in my life. I feel that my job is beneath me as what I'm doing right now. I should have a better job. I live in a crummy little apartment, which I hate. I want a house. I want all the things that I had before. And where do I get started? How do I get doing this?
You lost you lost a job, and you lost...
I've had 3 or 4 jobs last year. Mm-hmm. And we sold the house. You know, I'm starting all over again.
What do you attribute these, how did this come about? The job loss,
one of them I was laid off. I knew it was coming, and I got laid off on that one. One of them I only had it for 2 months, and I got fired.
Did you get angry on the job? Or you get into conflicts with people on the job?
Well, that was a matter of opinion. I put my fist through the wall one time, but I thought I was just showing my expression. They took it as being angry. The woman that I worked with, I was in real estate at the time, and there was we were in new home sales, and there were 2 of us in the sales office. And this woman and I, she was quite vocal, just a loudmouth. She was a bitch, as a matter of fact. That's all she was. And we worked together for a while. And
you used that term to describe your wife, too.
Yeah, well, I could just about use it to describe all women right now, as far as I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. We got along okay for a while. I did put my fist through the wall one day in the sales office, but it was an accident.
Mm-hmm. Are you pretty explosive in your dealings with people in general?
I was at that time. I was very depressed, very angry, and very upset. And to work with this particular woman, who to this day, I still don't like her. She's not a good person. And so she finally went to the sales manager, and this is the thing that really irritates me. She never discussed with me our problem. She never came to me once. I went to her 2 or 3 times, which I was proud of myself at the time, because I never could do this with my wife. I went to her 2 or 3 times, and I could see there's a problem. I said, you know, there's a real problem here. Let's talk it out. And she was really rude with me. She wouldn't talk about it. She was uncommunicative. And then I said, well, that's your problem, man. You're screwed up. And so anyway, this gal that I was working with, we started drifting further and further apart. And then she went to the sales manager. Without ever discussing anything with me, she went to the sales manager and told him that I'd put my fist to the wall, and I was an SOB to work with, and so forth and so on. And he called me in and fired me. And I was very unhappy about that. That was one of the jobs I had.
Well, I certainly understand you've had a lot of disappointments in your recent life in particular. And earlier on too, or has this...
Yes.
You nod your head?
Yes, I believe my problem started from my childhood.
Well, I think that would be valuable to go into also, because, you know, this didn't start yesterday.
No.
And it didn't start the day before.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not likely to, you know, terminate tomorrow. I think it would be very helpful to you to find a therapist to work with and examine what the things are that you might be contributing to, or that lead to the kinds of difficulties that you have found yourself in. And I think that this is a good time. I think that the fact that you're are at a point that you are uncomfortable, that you are feeling kind of crummy about yourself and the world, would be a good time to take up this unfinished business and look at the totality of your life. It may take some time to do that, and I think that it can be done, and there's help available. And I realize that, you know, financial considerations play a part, but certainly would encourage you to find a competent therapist and stick with it. I have a sense you probably would.
Yes, now that I've finally been introduced to therapy, I am very high on it, and I am irritated at myself that I never received some type of counseling or therapy when I was a young person in my 20s, when I really needed it the most at that point in time, rather than all my education or night school or whatever I've done in my life. I've always leaned towards how can I make more money. I read business magazines, and when I went to night school, it was strictly related to business and increase my income. Half of that time should have been devoted to self-improvement and therapy.
Our time, unfortunately, is running short, but I'm curious, is there any one thing, you said it started from day one, is there any one thing in your childhood or growing up that you attribute your major difficulties to, and anything in particular that come to mind?
The lack of affection and love as a child, and also that, and being alone, and being an only child.
Lack of affection from
my mother and father.
Both parents?
Yes. Lack of affection, and then when I received no love and affection, and being an only child, I didn't have anyone to talk to. I spent an awful lot of time by myself as a child because they were alcoholics. I spent an awful lot of time by myself. I had a dog and a teddy bear, and that was it. And
do you have any friends?
Even as a youngster, I had a difficult time making friends. Because at that time, even as a child, I think I had a lot of anger in me, and very few friends. But at that, I learned. I didn't learn. I got off on the wrong foot in life by not communicating as a child, and it just carried over as the years went by.
I think you have certainly some pretty good understanding of some of the history. And is this something that was occurring in therapy, or that you arrived at in therapy?
Yes, just about everything that I know of therapy is what I've learned in the last year.
Well, okay. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
I enjoyed talking to you. Wish you lots of luck.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
I'd like to comment briefly on the interview with Richard that was just completed. I'd like to make a few comments about this man and his impression that he made on me first. It's pretty apparent that here we're dealing with a very angry and a very depressed and a rather hostile man. We can also understand something about his recent disappointment, his wife having left him, the divorce, and his feeling of being rather abandoned and alone. It was difficult for me to get a clear picture of what this man's recurrent patterns, maladaptive patterns are. We got a glimpse of that toward the very end of the interview when he talked a little bit about his deprived childhood, the lack of affection and tenderness and closeness in his parental home. And I do believe that's where his difficulties certainly originated from. I dwelled a good deal on the relationship with his wife because of my conviction that interpersonal relationships are the area that need to be explored, and that's why I spend a good deal of time on that. I didn't get a very clear picture of what happened in this marriage, except that here are two people, probably both of them rather self-oriented, rather narcissistic, and who were clashing because they were not capable of intimacy. And I think that that's this man's basic problem. He is not capable and has not been capable throughout his life of intimate relationships, of closeness a fear of closeness, no doubt, but also a difficulty that results from that. So here we have a man, I think, who is basically rather empty, who displays a certain bravado, who displays the role of hail fellow, well met, but it is superficial. Complicating also are this man's volatility, his tendency to be explosive, and his search for the ideal mate, the ideal companion. And he sees himself as kind of a person who's concerned quite a bit with show, and he's looking for this ideal object, and he's going to be disappointed as life goes on. I see him at this time in his life, in his 40s, as someone who's coming up against a crisis. There are recurrent disappointments, and they are rooted in his character, his whole history. He has never been able to form a close, intimate relationship with a woman, or perhaps with anyone. The question might be asked, how would I deal with this man in therapy if he were to see me in therapy? And there again, I did not get a very clear indication of what this man's maladaptive patterns are. I do believe that over a 6-month period, perhaps in once-a-week interviews, and he seems to be motivated, quite a bit could be accomplished in exploring what his interpersonal difficulties are, what he does, what he is looking for that leads to disappointments, and what might be done to help him to form more satisfying, harmonious relationships with other people. But I see this as a rather long drawn out and a rather protracted undertaking. The very fact that I was not able to get a very clear picture, a very succinct picture, would suggest, to me at least, that we're dealing with a rather deep-seated, long-standing problem, which often is referred to as narcissistic personality disorder. He is simply unable to relate to people except in a very superficial sort of way. I felt that any further exploration would take us into therapy, and I would certainly want to learn more about this man's past, his interpersonal relationships in the past that proved disappointing. The most recent one, certainly with his wife, who left him in the recent past, is an area where we need to deal with what he did to her, what she did to him, what his expectations are of her, what her expectations are of him. And I think it was quite apparent how disappointed both were. They apparently were both people not capable of close relationships. But it's the area of disturbed interpersonal relationships and the recurrent patterns, the maladaptive patterns, that are of primary interest to me in working with a person like that in psychotherapy. I don't think he's an ideal candidate for short-term therapy or perhaps for any kind of psychotherapy. There's the question of his impulsiveness and his anger, and the question of how long he would stay in therapy if he were to get into therapy. But at the same time, I think there's also a lot to be said on the positive side that would suggest that he might make progress and that psychotherapy definitely could help him, and I would certainly want to give it a try. As for my own reactions, which I find always interesting, I really didn't come to any clear feeling. On the one hand, I felt empathic with his difficulties, and at the same time, perhaps partly because of his basically narcissistic orientation, I did not feel very close or could not empathize with him very well, as I don't think he was very empathic to me. So there's a kind of superficiality that beclouds this inner emptiness that the man is suffering from.